pushed the alien probe through behind us. Want to send them a goodbye? Day asked. Maybe a middle finger? I laughed. It would be just our luck if they understood the intent and responded by blowing us out of the sky. Let's just get out of town with our skin intact, okay? Soon, we found ourselves back at Hub Zero with a dead vessel from an unknown civilization. It was interesting, though, that the design of the ship was quite comprehensible. A surge drive was easily identifiable from our scan, as was a fusion reactor and a magnetic hydrogen scoop system. Other parts were less recognizable, like the computer system and what had to be their version of a 3D printer. Interestingly, the ship did not seem to have a supply of drones or roamers or the makings of a full-on auto factory. Just the one printer and a small supply of what might be maintenance bots. It was a stripped-down von Neumann probe without the capability to replicate. Really nothing more than an exploratory scout. The immediate problem, though, was getting it operational. To do that, we would have to get the reactor going without a working ram scoop system to supply the reactor with fuel. To add insult to injury, Heaven vessels hadn't been built with ram scoops since the end of the war for Earth, when we converted to Casimir systems. So we had no way to collect hydrogen for the ship, even if we did have some other way to ram it into the reactor. We went around and around for hours, but in the end there was only one option. We'd have to install a Casimir generator. That would mean cutting into the ship and performing some surgery. I hope it's not going to feel violated when it wakes up, I said, and discovers a new body part. I'm sure there must be some B-movie covering this kind of thing, Day replied. But I'm coming up blank. Look, let's just put it in and apologize afterward. It took a week, all told, since we were extremely careful both in cutting our way into the vessel and in making sure that we got all the voltage and current requirements right. This must have been what Neil and Herschel felt like while deciphering the other's cargo ship. Activating, I said, and pressed the button. In the monitor window, the generator went through boot up, then came online, and the ship activated. This was the moment of truth. We hadn't detected any weapons in the ship, not even a railgun, but you never knew. The ship sent out a Sudar pulse, easily identifiable. It had scanned us. Hopefully it would see that we were at Hub Zero and would come to the obvious conclusion. You know we're just going to have the same problem communicating with this guy, I said. No common format for radio comms, no common SCUT channels, no nothing. Assuming it even has SCUT. I didn't see one. So use the same solution and hope this guy's at least as smart as the sentries. Well, why not? I positioned myself in front of the alien ship, sent out a drone with a laser, and .38. Starfleet just won't go away. Bill, May 2343, in Vert. The wormhole endpoints were all well on their way, and within a few years we expected to have a path from Epsilon Eridani to Skippyland. Of course, Howard had decided to set up a full network for fun and profit. On the quiet for now, since we didn't want to publicize this invention ahead of time. The Ragnarok ecosystem build was going very well. I now had predator-prey relationships that didn't oscillate into extinctions anymore. I'd lost a couple of iterations of deer due to over-efficient wolf packs, but I now had the ratios right. I was examining a graphic of population fluctuations in Vert when I received an email from a Bob that I didn't recognize. Someone named Hector. A quick search placed him about 18th generation, one of the Bobs who was taking his von Neumann probe heritage seriously. He'd been heading for the patch of sky that Lenny had claimed for Starfleet. Sure enough, as I read through the missive, Starfleet was involved. They had apparently threatened Hector if he didn't reroute around their space. But threatened with what? Hector didn't elaborate, which probably meant Starfleet hadn't been specific. He was following their instructions since, as he explained, he wasn't set on any particular direction except away. But it was concerning behavior, and he thought I should know. Fair enough, and he was right. If Starfleet was now threatening people, they'd either flipped out completely or they were really, really holding a grudge. Neither was good. I sent a quick text off to Will since he seemed to have his finger on the pulse of everything political. Quite a feat for a Bob who was also heading away as fast as he could. The answer came back immediately. Nope, haven't heard anything specific. Of course, those guys are sufficiently bonkers that this doesn't surprise me. But it's going to become an increasing problem, Bill. Eventually, UFS space will reach and then surround Starfleet's claimed area. Then what? Another war? I sighed and waved the population graphic closed, then closed the text window. Will was right. We'd decided to ignore Starfleet as soon as they stopped showing up at moots, but in this case, Forgotten was not gone. A confrontation wasn't the best strategy, though. Perhaps I should start with some information gathering. One of the odd things about Starfleet during the war was how they'd completely left the solar system alone. It had been obvious enough to elicit comment from several Bobs, including Charles, who should know better than anyone. Was that simple nostalgia, or evidence of a deeper connection? Well, the wormhole project was on track, my Ragnarok ecosystem was currently problem-free, and I was getting a sore forehead from bashing my head against the wormhole problem. Maybe it was time for a distraction. 39. A civil discussion. Bob, June 2343, in Vert. Teresa had invited me to her place, in VR, that is, and since I hadn't seen her in a while, I was unreasonably excited. She had recently discovered the UFS Federal Library and had jumped in with both feet. She hadn't even answered messages for several days. Now it looked like she was finally coming up for air. We didn't have a need for tokens, being on the same subnet by tacit agreement, but it was still polite these days to knock first. I received an ack, then popped in. I was taken aback, though, to find the layout considerably changed. I was in what I'd have called a home theater room back on old Earth. Teresa was sitting, in Quinlan form, in an easy chair reminiscent of the furniture in the Heavens River transit system. She patted the arm of an empty chair beside her, so I converted to Inoki and took the hint. Are we going to watch a show?
A couple, actually. Just short clips. A few are from your YouTube site, and a few are from our own version, which, for some awful reason, has been dubbed QuinTube.
She paused.
You do understand there's no cultural justification for that name?
I smiled at her. Remember what I said about the English language? Turns out it also infects other languages. Kind of like an STD. Teresa looked confused for a moment, then said,
We don't have those different mating strategies and all, but I get your point. Anyway.
The big screen lit up, showing a Quinlan quartet. They began singing right away. No intro, no warm-up, no credits. QuinTube still needed some refinement, it seemed. But the singing was, well, incredible. I'd heard some street performances in Heavens River and had been impressed, but those were mostly solos and probably impromptu. This was a practiced, coordinated group. The way the multiple melody lines interwove and... Wait a minute. I frame jacked and backed up a few mils. A bit of quick filtering, and I came out with 6 different melody lines, with only 4 participants. I returned to VR normal and opened my mouth to comment, but Teresa paused the video and beat me to it.
I see that you've noticed the singing. Bob, I knew humans had poor hearing, but while researching the issue, I discovered that it's a lot more involved. We have a wider audible frequency range, yes, but we also have finer discernment within that range. And vocally, we have the ability to simultaneously sing 2 notes. So an experienced singer, she gestured to the screen, can sing 2 melody lines at once.
Wow, I said. Not very erudite, Bob. Teresa rolled her eyes. No, actually rolled her eyes, not the Quinlan equivalent.
If you weren't in a Quinlan avatar right now, I'm not sure you'd even hear the whole composition.
Is this important?
Anek has been talking about ways to improve cultural contact between our species. He is of the opinion that the Pav are rather... he disapproves of their isolationist strategy, let's just say.
She gestured at the screen.
What would you think of a Quinlan media company?
Distributing pieces like this? I nodded slowly. I have all the artistic talent of a fence post, honestly, but I know a lot of people would go crazy over this. Teresa nodded silently, and I continued. So what other Quinlan wonders did you have to show me?
On the contrary, Bob.
She waved a hand, and the screen changed to another video. This was a human ballet of... I did a quick search. Swan Lake, apparently. I watched people caper and leap for a few moments. I was by no means a fan of ballet, but the skill on display was obvious. Then the scene changed to ballroom dancing. Before I could ask a question, a square dance popped up. Then a skip routine, that being the current incarnation of hip-hop. I'd hated hip-hop when I was alive, and I saw no reason to change my opinion. Okay, I dance about as well as I sing, Teresa. The punchline?
Have you seen Quinlan's dance?
I opened my mouth to reply, then stopped before I could say something that I'd have to apologize for. Yes, I hit the town of Elbow just at festival time.
I have always been quite proud of Quinlan dance.
She paused and stared at the screen for a moment.
I was a good dancer in my youth. Not professional caliber, you understand, but talented by Quinlan standards.
She gestured at the screen, which froze with one of the ballerinas in the middle of a grand jeté.
This makes me embarrassed to even use the word. Human agility and grace are...
She stopped and shook her head. Again, the human gesture, not the Quinlan equivalent.
The cultural exchange will be two-way. The Quinlans I've shown this to swear that it must be special effects.
Well, we have those too.
Yes, I've seen some of your movies.
Cultural exchange on those as well?
I truly hope not.
I chuckled, and she continued.
Do you know what the sensory differences between humans and Pav are?
Not offhand, no. Please enlighten me.
Sorry, I cannot. Interestingly, no one seems to have thought to ask.
But someone like Bridget, Teresa cut me off.
Bio-human contact with the Pav has been rare and strictly by video communication. After all, they went straight into stasis, then got dumped on a remote planet. Only Bobs have had any degree of contact with them, and I have to say, as a group, you are remarkably obtuse about such questions.
Huh. I sat in silence for a few moments thinking about this. Maybe you found yourself a new career here, Teresa. Ministry of Exobiological Diplomacy or something. It certainly seems to be something that slipped through the cracks. Teresa gave me a smile.
I've talked to a few people. This just might happen.
40. Going in. Howard, September 2343, Jabberwocky. Today was the day. We'd received the cultural and language files from the gamers, and they'd been uploaded to the Drannies. Now Bridget and I were having a strategy session. We sat in our apartment in front of her computer. The canvas displayed several overlapping windows, including a global map of Jabberwocky and several relief maps and images of dragon villages.
This is a good place to start,
she said, pointing to a spot on the virtual globe.
High enough population density that we won't stand out. Good weather. I have no desire to wait out one of their tropical storms, thank you very much. There are several floaters.
Bridget couldn't help a slight wince as she said the word.
With more than one village on them. Diversity builds tolerance. I want to find out more about this warlord character. He's the Alexander the Great wannabe that's supposedly causing a lot of flux.
But this is a cultural and xenopological expedition, right? I gave her a side eye. We're not going to get involved, right? Bridget sighed.
I hope not, Howard. The Bobs do have a habit of sticking their noses into things, though.
You're not a Bob.
I am an honorary Bob.
She smiled at me.
I am as nosy as any of you.
I have no idea how to respond to that in a way that won't get me punched. She punched me anyway. Ow! I rubbed my shoulder. No fair. Bridget grew serious again.
Howard, the Bobs decided a long time ago that the prime directive is a load of hooey when a species is in existential danger. I'm not sure if the dragons are at that level of risk or if this is just another war that will someday be a historical footnote. But
Bridget's expression darkened.
I want to know if that's still going on.
I nodded, then made a "you first" gesture. Interestingly, the translation software converted it to a motion with my tail. It was probably human chauvinism talking, but it struck me as a little obscene. Bridget didn't seem bothered, though, and did a graceful dive off the edge. I admired her lines for a moment, then followed. Bridget held the dive for several seconds before opening her wings and arcing upward. I followed, not especially trying to catch up. At the top of her arc, she pulled in her wings, whooped, and did a backflip before settling into a proper glide. I pulled up beside her and grinned. Addicting, isn't it? She smiled back at me.
Quinn was fun. This is incomparable. I wonder if we could put wings on Huey's.
No, of course. I stopped mid-sentence. Why not, exactly? I looked behind me. Well, if I remembered right, a tail of some kind was required for control and balance, but something could be rigged. Or we could just go with dragon physiology, since we already seem to have it on lock. Of course, there were the issues of gravity, and
Earth to Howard. Come in, Howard.
I started and glanced at Bridget, who was trying and not quite succeeding in not laughing at me.
You went into Bob Fugue. Were you analyzing the engineering or the profitability?
I plead the fifth, or whatever it is these days. But the engineering, profitability is a given, I think.
It's still the fifth, Howard. It's just a saying now. I doubt most people know what it refers to. I had to look it up myself.
We flew in silence for a few minutes, unconsciously taking advantage of updrafts whenever possible. The dragon vision seemed to have some kind of sensitivity to polarized light that made updrafts visible. Made sense, it would be a survival characteristic. The dragons could put on good speed when they needed to, but they were large and heavy for a flyer, and therefore long-distance gliders by nature when updrafts were available. I wondered if they used to migrate or something similar in their prehistory. I'd have to ask Bridget. I spotted a lake below that didn't seem to be steaming or roiling. Want to try a little fishing? Bridget looked where I was pointing and wordlessly banked in that direction.
The gamers will have programmed in fishing reflexes, but remember, they've only been tested in VR. Take it easy the first time in.
That's me, Mr. Conservative, I replied with a laugh and swooped in low. Dragon eyes were adapted for seeing through the water's surface as well. I dipped a little lower and spotted something coming up in my flight path. The dragon reflexes took over, putting me into a stall as my feet reached out, claws extended. I hit the water face first with a thunderous splash. Coming up spitting and coughing, I looked up to see Bridget grinning at me.
You caught a submerged log, Mr. Conservative. Or it caught you. Come on up and try again.
Getting out of the water wasn't easy, even for Dranny muscles. It wasn't a case of getting waterlogged, more an issue of drag, preventing me from getting up enough speed to lift off. I'm not hungry anyway, I said. Maybe some other time.
We should both do it at least once, Howard, just in case we have to perform in front of real dragons. Practice makes perfect.
And with that, she circled around for another pass. I followed, muttering under my breath. We swooped down in parallel and hit targets at almost the same instant. I came up with a lovely trout in one claw. I held it up to Bridget, who had come up empty.
Don't you dare gloat,
she said. Wouldn't dream of it. I'm going to settle on the shore while you give it another shot.
Practice makes perfect.
I received a black glare, which I studiously ignored, and settled onto a rock outcropping. The fish was still alive and flipping desperately in my grip. I really didn't need the food, so I tossed it back into the water. Meanwhile, Bridget had been more successful on her second pass and came to a landing beside me. She smiled and flipped her own fish back. I settled onto the crouch that was the dragon equivalent of an indolent sprawl. It's a pretty good life. Makes me wonder why the dragons bothered to become intelligent.
I agree, Howard. And certainly I or someone else will be studying them in the long term to answer that question. But I'm sure the environment of Jabberwocky has something to do with it. This is a harsh place to live.
I nodded thoughtfully. Other than some miscellaneous islands, the planet's land surface was concentrated in 2 continents, which Mario had named Atlantis, where the dragons were situated, and Lemuria to the west. A huge stretch of ocean reminiscent of the Pacific took up about a third of the globe to the west of Lemuria. I had to agree with Bridget that he wasn't putting a lot of effort into names, but his interests were pretty focused. Mario told us that Atlantis is far more tectonically active than the other landmass. I mused. I suppose that could have played a part in evolutionary pressure. Bridget laughed.
Listen to you sounding all biologist-y. But yes, you're right.
She stood.
Well, lunch hour is over. We should find a place to stay. Floater ahead. Locals call it the Hunter.
Bridget paused, internally accessing her notes.
The villages are Hunter's Heaven, Hunter's Rest, and Hunter's Glory. Usually just referred to as Heaven, Rest, and Glory.
No theme there. No siree.
Most floaters only have one village. This particular one is very old. They keep growing, apparently, as long as they live.
What kills a floater? Do they have natural enemies?
They have no predators. There are some species of plants and trees that are parasitic rather than commensal or symbiotic. The most common causes of death actually are volcanism and lightning. Jabberwocky has a pretty mild climate overall, and volcanoes don't just spring up overnight. But on the other hand, floaters aren't really powered flyers. They have kind of a sail thing underneath, but only minimal propulsion capability, so they can't get out of the way of a storm or an eruption.
Lightning, hydrogen. Bad combo. Bet it's spectacular, though. I stopped talking as I spotted our destination in the distance. Floating serenely through a low point between rolling hills, the floater was literally an island in the sky. I could see the sail that Bridget had mentioned, fully extended at the moment beneath the behemoth like a giant keel. Also dangling down were something like long vines, which seemed to move around in the wind. Occasionally they dragged along the ground, then would retract into the bulk of the floater. Eating? Drinking? Was it snagging vegetation or little animals? Once again, Bridget would know. I glanced at Bridget and saw her frowning. Was she wondering the same thing? The top of the floater was shaped somewhat like the top half of a bagel. Forest ran in a ring around a central depression, which was usually filled with water. The central reservoir was both a source of drinking water for the dragons and a place to keep and raise fish stock. Although the dragons weren't particularly disciplined about it, the lake was also a water source for the floater and a quick way to make more hydrogen on demand. I knew from the reading I had done that most of the trees were symbiotic with the floater. They provided nourishment in return for a place literally in the sun. Some trees were in a more parasitic relationship, as Bridget had mentioned, and those could easily be spotted by the reaction of the floater's surface, forming a sort of angry hummocked blister around the plant. Dragons did their part for their home by preferentially using those trees as building material and fuel. So, yeah, fuel. On a hydrogen gas bag, they had open flames. I was extremely interested in seeing how this did not result in a Hindenburg-level disaster. I imagined there had to be rules, probably very strictly enforced. We came in low and did a hard upward arc at the last moment, dropping onto the edge of the floater with almost zero momentum. It seemed like a better system than what blue-footed boobies used, which often involved face plants as a braking device. Yes, I watched a lot of YouTube back when I was alive. A squad of 5 dragons immediately marched over to us and pointed spears in our direction.
"Home floater,"
one said. Then before I could even respond,
"Reason for visit."
I opened my mouth to answer, but Bridget beat me to it.
"Who's asking?"
The spokesdragon cocked her head, more like an owl than a human, and paused, considering Bridget for a moment. Then, apparently deciding not to be offended, she replied,
"Have you been living under a rock? Alexander's army has been seen within 50 miles of here. We've intercepted scouts several times a day. If he's targeting this area, we need to be ready for him. Thus, my very reasonable questions." "Yeah, okay. We're..."
Bridget inclined her head in my direction, a move that acknowledged my existence while simultaneously dismissing me as insignificant.
"From a floater, about 300 miles east. Nirvana. It's a college town. We decided to head west until we hit the Western Ocean. This Alexander is news to us. Seems like kind of a local problem."
Spokesdragon gave Bridget a look of disbelief, but apparently didn't feel like making the effort to explain.
"And reason for visit?" "Sleep, rest. We don't need anything. We've been able to catch trout along the way."
Spokesdragon frowned.
"Really? Most people report the pickings being extremely slim these days." "Most people are probably impatient,"
Bridget replied archly.
"You can winkle them up to the surface with some bait, but it takes commitment."
She patted her front pack meaningfully. The other dragon glanced down, following the movement, then shrugged.
"You know, if you can demo that technique, you can probably get people to pay you for lessons."
I queried the translation software and database. Pay was not quite the right word. Dragons didn't have an official monetary system, at least not anything standardized. Not surprising, with no centralized government authority of any kind. So everything was barter. But metal was rare enough to be prized, and various kinds of metal coins formed a sort of de facto standard of exchange. Their weight and size varied all over the place, of course, with no central authority to mint them. Value was based on weight, and coins were as likely as not to be melted down to make something practical. It was noteworthy that adulterating coins was one of the few crimes that would net you the death penalty here, often at the hands of an angry mob. Bridget didn't respond, instead nodding toward the village. At a gesture from Spokesdragon, the squad stepped aside, and we proceeded on our way.
"Don't make trouble,"
she said to our backs. Not really much of a third degree, I commented to Bridget in a low voice. I'd say security could use an upgrade.
Dragons have very good hearing and smell, she replied. Some individuals have a reputation for being able to literally smell a liar and can probably hear a raised heart rate, like an old-fashioned lie detector. It's an actual job description, which...
Bridget paused to check the database.
The gamers have translated as Sooth Hunter. I imagine the group leader was one of those.
I mentally rolled my eyes.
Why not just lie detector? Gamers, Bridget replied. Why are you surprised?
Fair enough. The gamers had been going further and further down the rabbit hole since the Heavens River episode, only emerging in public for really interesting things like xenobiological analyses. There was a meme going around where gamers get dropped into a black hole and don't even notice for months. The town was large but ramshackle, there obviously being no building code or zoning bylaws. It also didn't limit itself to a single level, since dragons were very much arboreal. Businesses that needed terra firma clustered on the ground, while everything else snaked its way up trees in all directions, either attached to the trunk or branches or suspended by ropes. It seemed like anarchy, but a few seconds of examination revealed an underlying order. This was a medieval village built in 3 dimensions. There were even hotels of a sort, which mostly consisted of suspended pods with access to running water, both hot and cold. It was interesting that when sentience built a civilization, one of the first things they did was engineer for running water. There was probably a PhD thesis in there somewhere, but I'd leave that for someone else. Bridget had mentioned that dragon towns ranged from medieval village to Renaissance city in both size and knowledge. There actually was a city named Nirvana, and it actually was a college town, something Bridget had picked up through one of the spy drones. The dragon civilization was very old and relatively static. They had apparently achieved a level of technology that was comfortable and settled in. The towns on this floater could be hundreds of years old and probably hadn't changed much in all that time. We had an unlimited supply of money, of course, since we could just order more from the drone. It was a far cry from the situation in Heavens River, and I intended to enjoy the freedom, starting with a covered sleeping berth and hot water. The water wasn't piped to each pod, but was accessible in a central area. It came from a containment vessel higher up in the trees, which produced water pressure from a gravity feed. The hot water was more accurately described as warm, but it seemed to be heated using solar heating of clay pipes painted black. These people, for all that they were barely past the Stone Age in many ways, were not by any means stupid. In fact, they seemed to be quite clever at ad hoc engineering. The hotel proprietor, a crusty old curmudgeon of a dragon, took payment and pointed us to a room with a liberal dose of opinion at no charge. The flow didn't seem to have any logical cohesion, just a spew of complaints about everything, including the weather, the quality, size, and quantity of trout being caught, volcanic activity, and so on. But eventually he ran down and we made our escape. The pods were suspended in a row below a stout branch of a tree, and these trees were huge. In the lower gravity and thicker atmosphere of Jabberwocky, they grew tall, wide, and strong. You could walk along most of the main branches and even squeeze past people going in the opposite direction. The clawed feet also allowed a good grip on the tree bark, so going a little off vertical wasn't really a problem. I inspected the pod close up and realized it was anchored both to the branch above and to a weighted net below, so that movement and swaying were kept to a minimum, especially when landing or launching. Again, pretty good engineering when they needed it. We settled in, doffing our front packs, and I took a moment to examine the interior. This pod was literally like a giant birdhouse, with a single opening for a door and some holes for ventilation. A spongy floor material completed the decor and functioned as a bed. I checked the database out of curiosity. Private residences tended to be similar, with different rooms suspended individually. Families would usually own all or part of a branch. Out the front door, the sun of Jabberwocky was just sinking below the horizon. I couldn't get a complete view with all the foliage and other construction, but what I could see was spectacular. I remembered the sunsets on Vulcan, which were also mind-blowing, and wondered if perhaps that was simply the natural order of things. Maybe humans had gotten used to a pale, insipid version back on old Earth. Bridget patted the floor beside her, and I took the hint. We curled up like a couple of cats, which seemed to be the normal dragon sleeping habit for couples.
Tomorrow I want to examine the floater tendrils. I have a theory, she said, wiggling to get comfortable. I grunted, content to do whatever she wanted. I closed my eyes, then we left the Drannies on auto and returned to our Mannies in Trantor. 41. A disturbing discovery. Bill, July 2343, Sol System. I hadn't visited Charles in more than 8 years. Maybe not surprising, though. He had webcams going so anyone could look in on the progress of the Earth project at any time. It was one of the more popular BobTube video feeds. The reclamation crew was making great strides with Terra, and 200 years after humanity nuked the planet into a new ice age, more than 50% of the globe was now completely ice-free. Another 50 years and they estimated they'd be back to normal pre-industrial temps. The high CO2 levels helped as well, although there was a project underway to reduce that as well. I've been getting caught up on your progress, Charles. The planet is coming along nicely. Charles waved the comment off. The tensor field printers are going to make all the difference, Bill. We might have to take some liberties with cell structures, but we collected enough DNA to recreate 98% of species, if you include insects. Even some that were already extinct in original Bob's time. And the climate, back to interglacial. Weather patterns are still all over the place, but that will smooth out as the atmosphere and ocean temps settle into some kind of regular pattern. I stood and idly poked a globe of the moon hanging on display, which showed oceans and clouds. Is this real time? Pretty close. It started as a dare or something, but some group decided to terraform the moon. It's going well, and they're even starting to get a magnetic field going. What? How? With next to no rotation. They've got a lunar day down to about 50 hours. Mover plates. Not just for destroying stars. Charles smiled as he said this, but I still noticed a reserve that didn't used to be there. Did he suspect what I was really here for? Starfleet had never attempted any kind of attack in Sol. Did Charles wonder about that too? Venus as well, I said, pointing at one of the other globes. Uh-huh. Day length at about 100 hours and still coming down. And Mars, he pointed at the fourth globe. All different problems, but a lot of the same tools. We'd like to bring humanity back to the solar system eventually, and we want to give them options. I said, frowning. What? The thing is, Charles, I shifted in my chair. Long term, I'm not sure if it's going to be as attractive for humans. The flying cities are a controlled environment, and other than considerations of gravity, it really doesn't matter what the planetary environment is like. The O'Neill Corp is building megastructures, and those will be able to orbit any star that isn't too variable. Engineers are even talking about using a fusion light source like the Quinlans did, which would do away with the need for a star at all. Add mover plates and humanity becomes a truly interstellar species. There will always be the back-to-nature types and the keep-it-simple types. True enough. I eyed him and got a blank look back. Normally 2 Bobs would be relaxed and chatting away by now, but we were still essentially talking business.
There was no animosity, just no real friendliness either. Well, moving on. So do you mind if I wander the system a little? Just to get a look around? Charles waved a hand dismissively. Take as long as you want. I was walking along the shore of Mare Humorum accompanied by Benny, one of the lunar terraforming crew. He had volunteered immediately to show me around and seemed quite proud of the work they were doing. Ironically, the lunar maria, which had turned out to be lava beds, were actually the low points topographically, so they were now catching up with their names. The waters lapped slowly against the beach, moving languidly in the 1/6 gravity. Our manis were the new standard exploratory model, which meant vacuum-hardened with high-capacity repair systems. The lunar atmosphere was still too thin to keep the temperature swings in the reasonable range. CO2 would still occasionally sublimate out of the air at night in some places. I kicked at the ground. The lunar dust had succumbed to a couple of years of rain, and what had washed down into the ground was more the texture of sand and gravel. Some lichen was growing in patches, but nothing else. Of course, I'd literally written the book on terraforming, so none of this was a surprise. We're trying to move the schedule along a lot faster, Benny was saying. You were developing the process as you went, so slow and cautious made sense. Now, he gestured to the land around us, we can multitask and overlap stages. I nodded while wondering how I was going to subtly bring the conversation around to my goal. Subtlety was not a Bob Johansen trait. So, Benny, have any of the crews found anything interesting while digging the Earth back out? Interesting? Like what? Oh, I don't know. A lot of stuff could get buried. Then I had a minor flash of genius. For instance, there was some speculation that Dr. Landers might have had an extra Bob Johansen backup stashed away where faith monitors wouldn't find it. Benny laughed. Oh, nothing like that, no. Although we did find some powered-down mining equipment. Remember Rudolph Kazini? Yeah, he's part of the crew now. You should meet him. He's, honest to God, the stereotypical Russian. Accent, vodka swilling and all. And he thinks manis come directly from God. I laughed. That was at least one piece of good news. Any other replicants? Benny's face fell. We dug out the old Institute building, but the replicant computer room had collapsed. No way to recover them, and there was that Homer backup that someone found. Aha. I had to be casual, though. Don't scare him, don't make him lock up. I thought Homer destroyed all his backups. I'm sure he thought he did, but someone named Jerry found one, or says he did. Interesting. Do you know where I can find Jerry? Benny shook his head. He was a collateral descendant from several generations up. If I remember right, he was working with the asteroid mining group. You could check with them. And I would. But meanwhile, the moon tour was, honestly, very interesting. I looked up at the Earth, floating in the sky at first quarter, softened by the new atmosphere, and smiled. Howard would monetize this in a heartbeat. The asteroid mining group wasn't hard to find. They were a little, odd by regular Bob standards, though. Maybe it was a bit of a cosplay thing, but their private VRs were apartments in their main moot, which was made up to look like the asteroid series in The Expanse. Okay, made sense, I guess, for asteroid miners, but how bored did you have to be? Unfortunately, they couldn't tell me where Jerry was. In fact, Jerry hadn't been heard from in decades. The Homer backup story was generally considered to be an urban myth, though, and the general consensus was that Jerry had just decided to go von Neumanning. I had another theory, though, one far less appealing. 42. Flying around. Howard, September 2343, Jabberwocky. I opened my eyes to find myself still entwined with Bridget's Dranny. I was contemplating the situation and feeling my Dranny's sleepiness slowly dissipate when Bridget opened her eyes. Vertical pupils, it turns out. I hadn't actually noticed before. "So, what shall we do with our day?" I asked her.
Coffee.
We just had coffee. Back home. No coffee here.
Not quite true, Howard. Dragons don't have caffeine as such. They use alcohol instead, a hot drink, mostly ethanol, with some spices for flavor. It's called tuev.
Seriously? Isn't flying under the influence kind of a problem? Bridget sat up and stretched, sort of like a cat, extended 4 limbs, then arching her back until the stretch worked its way back to her. Apparently flight wasn't the only thing that worked on male dragons. Bridget's gaze trailed downward and she smiled. Sometime later I stretched and said, "So, tell me about tuev."
The dragons metabolize alcohol. It doesn't make them drunk. It's like sugar in this biosystem, only more so.
Huh. So a good stiff martini in the morning gets you ready for the day?
Uh-huh. Just like back home, sort of.
She chuckled.
Let's get some breakfast.
We stepped out onto the porch, which was really just a horizontal pole attached to the pod. I had a momentary image of myself as a parakeet in a cage, and I had to suppress the urge to ask for a cracker. Bridget would have killed me, and no one would prosecute. A short hop with only a couple of wing beats got us onto the main branch, and we joined a procession of dragons, many looking like they also needed that first cup of wake-me-up. We ended up in front of an open-air kiosk where a harried-looking vendor was trading coins for a cup of something. I looked down at the coins in my hand and realized that they were copper and iron. Interesting. Just like Heaven's River. Apparently it wasn't just biology that tended to stick to a theme. When my cup of life arrived, I took a tentative sniff, then a small sip. "Jesus," I muttered. "What is this stuff, Everclear?"
Almost pure ethanol, like I said, Bridget replied via intercom. And keep your voice down, you just spoke in English.
I ignored the admonishment but switched to intercom.
"This stuff is safe?" "For dragons, yes. 1 cup of it would melt a human liver into a green sludge."
We hopped up onto a convenient log and perched, slowly sipping our morning tuev. I had to admit it did seem to produce the same effect as coffee, assuming Bridget had gotten the biology of the Drannies right. Just one of many things I would never, ever say out loud. We were interrupted by a commotion at ground level near the base of the first tree. A crowd was swiftly gathering around 2 groups of dragons who seemed to be having a disagreement. Lots of pushing and yelling were involved. Instead of swooping down with the masses, we stayed put and swiveled our ears forward. Dragons had good hearing to begin with, and we had the enhanced Android version, so we had as good a seat as if we'd joined the onlookers on the ground. Dragon insults and cursing weren't particularly inventive, depending more on volume and repetition to get the point across, but from the few coherent words that occasionally got uttered almost by accident, I was able to determine that one group was Alexander's sympathizers who were trying to drum up grassroots support with the end game of peacefully joining up. They weren't getting a lot of chance to talk, though. I glanced sideways at Bridget and saw she was as surprised as I was. "This wasn't in the briefing materials?" I asked.
"The Alexander thing is a developing story, apparently. This is new. Up until now, he's just been attacking and taking over the occasional floater."
"For what? What's the point?" Bridget gave me a hard look.
"Poor Howard, and Bobs in general. You're so civilized and empathetic toward others that you just can't understand that some people are just assholes. This is no different from any number of tin-pot dictators in Earth history. Little men, mostly, who measure their worth by the number of people and amount of resources they control." I shook my head, feeling suddenly combative. "And again, to what end?" This isn't an instrumental goal, Howard. The control is the end game. It's not for anything.
I sighed and silently conceded the argument. There was simply too much evidence from history that she was right. Meanwhile, the argument had ended with the Alexander sympathizers being physically hoisted into the air and tossed over the side. While they could have just circled around and come back, it probably would have resulted in a repeat performance, but with more spear action. Anyway, there was something in the briefing about how being tossed over the side had broader social implications, like being branded or discarded. We continued to sip our morning booze while the crowd slowly dispersed. People started filtering back up the tree, including back to the kiosk. I buttonholed one individual as she bought a 2EV and some kind of breakfast wrap. She gave us the once-over, and a faint look of distaste came over her features.
Foreigners,
she muttered. Then she shrugged and said,
Alexander's conquest keeps getting bigger and it's getting closer. He calls it a nation, apparently. A lot of people are nervous, and some have decided that a preemptive surrender is a good strategy. Maybe they can fly to his nation and join up directly now that they're baseless.
Baseless, I remembered, was what you were if you got tossed overboard. It meant not having a home, which technically included Bridget and me. Foreigners.
Rumor has it they've set fire to floaters that defied them, she continued. That seems far-fetched, though. No one would be that stupid.
I could see the shocked look on Bridget's face and quickly checked my briefing notes. I'd been thinking of the floaters in an overly casual context, apparently. Dragons had an almost religious reverence for them. And burning one would be like sacking the capital city of your enemy. Something humans had done with casual abandon all throughout history, except that floaters were living, breathing beings, not just a patch of ground.
Doesn't that just create a whole tribe of committed enemies?
Bridget asked.
If they live. Word is the Alexandrians surround the floater and kill anyone trying to escape.
Our companion gave us a skeptical look and a slight tip of her cup before moving on. Well, that sucks, I commented.
It more than sucks. Floaters have very low reproduction rates, which is typical for a species that is large, long-lived, and doesn't have much in the way of natural enemies. And they aren't useful as villages until they reach a certain size. This Alexander character could single-handedly change the ecology of Jabberwocky.
Want to hit him with a buster? She smiled at me.
Did I accidentally call you civilized? But no. Chances are one of his lieutenants or children would just take over. We'd have to obliterate a good fraction of the army to stop it, and I think that's more than even the most warlike Bobs could stomach.
So we're going to...
I don't know, Howard. Wing it?
I nodded, then realized she was giving me an expectant look. I replayed what she'd said, then groaned and got a smile in response. We took to the air from one of the outer branches, then circled around to glide below the floater. It was slowly drifting eastward with the slight wind from the hills. As we came over a lake, the floater dipped its tendrils and dragged them through the water. Bridget circled with me following. As we came to the far edge of the lake, the tendrils retracted and Bridget moved in. Dragons weren't birds, but they did have a lot of the same talents, such as the ability to grab a vertical perch and hang off sideways. Bridget inched her way down the tendril, then began pulling up the remaining length. I circled and watched her work. After another minute, Bridget dropped off the vine and caught air. I pulled up beside her as she described an arc that would take us back to the town. And, I said,
later, I have to think about this.
That meant she'd found something interesting. The wait would be frustrating, but worth it. 43. Learning Curve.
Icarus, October 2321, heading to Centaurvania. It took more than a week to get up to the point of being able to hold a conversation. The alien ship, which we named Gunther because it was close to the ship's name for itself, picked up the math concepts immediately. But when we tried moving to language elements, such as verbs, things faltered. Day's theory was that Gunther was more of an AMI or an AI rather than a replicant, so it had no actual physical life experience with which to contextualize statements like, "See Dick run." I thought perhaps it was just more alien than we were used to. Either way, we had to back up several steps and reduce the graphics to a Pac-Man level before we started to make progress. But progress we did, and eventually we had our translation routine loaded with a passable version of Gunther's language. It didn't seem interested in learning ours, or maybe wasn't able to, so it fell to us to take care of the translation back and forth. Even then, things proceeded on more of a question and answer basis than any kind of conversation. Gunther was cooperative, but not inspired. Star charts were easy, though. We quickly established that Gunther had come from a budding civilization near one of the leaf nodes of the third hub clockwise from Hub 0, although it became cagey about specifics. This meant it had come from essentially the opposite end of the Empire from us. The bios that had built Gunther appeared to be generally centauroid, in that they had 4 legs underneath and 2 arms at the front. The proportions were totally out of whack, though. More like dachshunds with arms sticking out of their necks rather than horses with human torsos. Still, centaurs stuck immediately, and the home planet became Centaurvania. And it turned out Gunther had once been a bio, and actually was a true replicant. The centaurs had 3 sexes, according to Gunther: male, female, and worker. The third was similar in nature to a worker ant. No participation in procreation, but dedicated to the support of its genetic line. And apparently disposable when a mind was needed for replication into a space probe. Gunther was close-lipped about it, but I got the impression that the word volunteer hadn't really figured into things. The civilization that had built Gunther had discovered surge drives and Sudar, but hadn't yet invented Scut communications. That seemed to be a standard tech path based on our very small sample size of 3, humanity, the others, and centaurs. Once they had the base technologies working, they'd immediately sent out a scout and done a rush job to beat out the local competition, which explained the bare-bones design. This was beginning to sound a lot like our human history. Gunther had found a wormhole at its first destination that apparently followed a very similar exploratory trajectory to Day's and mine, hopping from system to system and mapping each system location relative to the galaxy. This activity had eventually culminated in capture by the sentries and, as we'd suspected, a gradual loss of power reserves until it had been forced to shut down. Unlike us, Gunther had never deciphered the gate IDs. That was unfortunate because we could have used the timestamps on the packets to determine how long it had been a captive. Eventually, we managed to convince Gunther that we weren't a threat, mostly by pointing out that we'd rescued and revived it, and we were armed, and it wasn't. And there wasn't a logical scenario whereby lying about our intentions made sense. And it did need to go home to report in. So, in due time, we all agreed we would head for Gunther's world. The trip through the gate systems was routine: 3 hops through the hubs, then 1 hop to a leaf node. This was the star system that Gunther had originally aimed for from its home system. It had, of course, done an extensive survey when it arrived, but We wanted to see for ourselves. So, we prevailed upon Gunther to wait while we surveyed the system. Like most star systems, as we'd learned by now, only one planet was in the Goldilocks zone, and that was where we found the civilization that had lived here. Based on city layouts and proportions, this was a new species to us, the 16th we'd cataloged while exploring the Empire. And, interestingly, this ecosystem had retinal-based photosynthesis, only the second such example. This resulted in plants that were a rich mauve or purple rather than the traditional green. It's really odd, Day grumbled when we'd completed the planetary mapping. By all measures, retinal should be a better basis for photosynthesis. It's simpler and more energy efficient, and most stars radiate more powerfully in the green band, which would give retinal the advantage. Yet almost every planet uses chlorophyll. There might be some obscure reason in evolutionary biology, I replied. Like the question of why virtually every species uses left-handed amino acids. We just don't know what that is. Still, a new civilization was always a great view from space, and a purple-hued planet was especially striking. We took a lot of pictures for our blog, assuming we were ever in contact with the Bobiverse again. The locals had, like most species, colonized most of the rocks in their system, as well as building a couple of megastructures. And like all the other civilizations we visited, everything was abandoned. No heat signatures, no radio traffic, no traffic, no nothing. I pinged Gunther. Was this abandoned when you first arrived here? Yes. Talkative as ever. Once again, I resolved to stop asking yes-no questions. Why did your civilization send you here first? Did they detect radio signals? Heat signatures?
Anomalous microwave sources,
Gunther replied. Of course, the microwave from the wormhole. Wait, sources? I did a quick sweep. Sure enough, there was another wormhole at minus 90 degrees. The other wormhole, did you explore it?
No.
I rolled my eyes in exasperation, mostly at myself. But really, Gunther had been presented with a coin flip situation and had made a choice that opened out into the Empire. Is it worth checking out? I asked Day. Let's at least send a drone through. We checked with Gunther, and it was willing to stay the extra week. A few days later, we found ourselves floating near the second wormhole. Yet another one, I thought. Then I caught my own attitude and mentally pinched myself. I was actually becoming bored with wormholes. Day had prepared a drone and sent it through with the usual precautions. The drone did the standard stellar survey and returned. I grumbled when we'd finished the analysis. I had half hoped it might put us in a system that's a little closer to Gunther's home, but no such luck. 15 light years away in the wrong direction. Indication of planets, but no other wormholes, and no traces of an active civilization. Dickie, this is really beyond weird and well into spooky. I'm beginning to worry that we might never find out what happened. I know, Day. These quickie surveys from space really aren't getting us any closer to figuring things out. We might have to bite the bullet and do a full archaeological deep dive on one of the abandoned planets. That'll be next. For now, let's visit Gunther's system. That probably has a better chance of us meeting someone. But they won't have the answer either. One thing at a time. Let's go. 44. Investigation. Howard, January 2344, Jabberwocky. Bridget wanted to explore more of the planet, but I was concerned enough about this Alexander business to want to investigate further. After some discussion, we compromised. We started our day by finding a large updraft near the Hunter, which we would consider our home, floater, and base of operations for the moment. Riding the updraft, we were able to climb to an altitude of almost 5 clicks. A real dragon would be gasping at that height, but still able to operate. We could have gone higher, but it would have attracted attention. From this height, the horizon was almost 250 kilometers away. Although, of course, things disappeared in the haze far short of that distance.
Lots of haze,
Bridget commented.
probably volcanic. I count,
She paused, turning her head.
42 individual hotspots. That's a lot of activity.
Kind of surprised there's as much complex life as we're seeing, I replied.
The Siberian traps caused the Permian extinction 250 million years ago on Earth,
Bridget said, glancing at me.
That was way worse. And there was already complex life.
She paused.
That was a relatively sudden event. Something similar is happening here, it looks like, but much more gradually. It would explain why so many life forms have taken to the air. It's the only reason I can think of for a species to risk hydrogen flotation.
I grinned. I bet selection pressure was a real bitch for a while. Bridget laughed and circled again.
I see 12 floaters randomly distributed, and it looks like a compact group over in that direction. A dozen or more floaters, I think.
She pointed to illustrate.
Want to bet that's Alexander's nation?
I followed her pointing finger with my gaze and frowned. That's more or less where we came down on our first outing. Those could have been Alexander's scouts who chased us.
Or scouts from a nearby floater thinking we were Alexander's scouts. Either way, it's an explanation.
I paused and tried to keep a straight face. So, what do you call a collection of floaters? Bridget rolled her eyes.
I suppose you have a suggestion.
A flotilla? A sigh was her only answer. I considered that a victory.
So what do we do?
She said, changing the subject.
Just fly in and introduce ourselves?
I started to answer, then stopped and squinted. Something was moving in the distance. I activated telescopic vision and zoomed in. It seems the decision is being made for us, I said, pointing. She followed my line, squinted, and went silent. After a few moments, she turned to me.
Looks like those sympathizers were more like scouts. That's a raiding party.
Sure enough, what looked like a couple hundred dragons were flying a ground-hugging route that seemed aimed at the Hunter. I suppose there could have been a more innocent explanation, but it seemed unlikely. Should we head back? I asked. Help defend?
I don't want to kill anyone,
Bridget replied.
Let's wait and watch. We can always head in afterward. We have a legitimate reason to be there, so the worst they might do is toss us out.
She hesitated.
I hope.
Within minutes, the raiding party was spotted, judging from the sudden increase in activity on the floater. But by then it was too late. The attackers flowed up from underneath the massive floating island, relying on it for protection and cover. At the last moment, they flicked up over the edge and came into land, spears in hand, where defenders were setting up with something more like pikes. As someone who grew up in 20th century America, I wasn't used to seeing such levels of direct violence. At least not outside of TV or theaters. Even from a distance, the fighting was brutal and unmerciful. A lot of dragons died. A lot more would be crippled for life, assuming they didn't die of infections. Dragon medical knowledge was at about the same level as any Iron Age civilization. A lot of ad hoc procedures, most of which were as likely to be harmful as helpful, or just flat out wrong. The fighting lasted perhaps 10 minutes, The attackers had targeted all three villages at the same time, and their timing was impeccable. A few dragons had fled, many hadn't fought at all, and the Alexandrians didn't seem interested in those individuals. Thank the universe they didn't seem to intend some kind of pogrom against the residents. Once things cooled off, we flew in and landed at our village. A couple of Alexandrians, easily identifiable from their bright blue and white armbands, came over to intercept us. We found ourselves facing a half-dozen or so spear points.
"What's your business?"
One of them said.
We stayed here last night. We're just passing through."
Bridget gestured vaguely up at the hotel pods.
"You don't seem about to burn things down, so I thought our hotel might still be in business."
The leader snorted and brought his spear to parade rest. The others followed suit.
"True enough,"
He said.
"The hunter is under new management, that's all. Mind your manners and keep your nose out of things that don't concern you. Go about your affairs."
We nodded to them and headed very carefully and slowly to our tree. A quick hop and we were at our hotel pod.
"So what now?"
Bridget asked. "We should maybe nose around carefully." I rubbed my snout speculatively. Wouldn't want to have it cut off for being a snoop. Things were settling down. The dead had been taken care of. Apparently the corpses were thrown into pits on the floater's topside and became part of its diet, and survivors had been bandaged up as much as possible. Well, poulticed. They didn't really have bandages or antibiotics. I expected the body count to rise for another few days. The Alexandrians had garrisoned the town, and presumably the other two, but other than that, they seemed to be mostly standing around playing tourist. However, I noted that the hunter had changed course and was now running an ungainly tack across the prevailing wind in the general direction of that knot of floaters we'd seen from above. Joining the flotilla, perhaps? Things appeared very calm in the village. Once the proprietors had realized it would be business as usual, they'd gone back to, business as usual. Customers were eating at kiosks, buying food at the market, bartering with shop owners for goods, and so on. Even some of the occupying army were engaging in some personal commerce. I accepted 2 cups of tuev from the proprietor of the kiosk, then paused and looked around. "This all seems very peaceful," I said to him. "Is this normal?" He shook his head.
"Don't think so. I've heard about the Alexandrians setting fire to entire floaters in retaliation for resistance and putting entire populations to death. This sure doesn't fit."
Maybe the tales are exaggerated? He gave me a hard look.
How do you exaggerate burning down a floater? Doesn't seem like something you could do part way. And the descriptions I've heard, well, they sounded more like eyewitness accounts than fanciful tales, you know.
I nodded and grunted out a, huh. After pausing for a sip of Tuev, I added, I guess we'll find out one way or the other soon enough.
Why do you say that?
They're steering the Hunter toward the Alexandrian fleet, I replied, or what I assume is their fleet. We were up high in an updraft when the attack came, and we could see a large knot of floaters close together. That's the direction the raid came from.
Bunch of floaters close together? They don't normally stay together. Not like batlings bunching up in a tight flock.
One more mystery, I muttered, and took my Tuev back to where Bridget was sitting. 45. Everyone goes ballistic. Howard, March 2344, Trantor. So, marketing campaigns. Not worth their weight in bird droppings, apparently. I sat on the couch in our Trantor apartment and read the report from the Hawking Institute. The Hueys had been rolled out across all civilized worlds to much hoopla and all available media. A huge blitz extolling the advantages combined with some well-applied FOMO for those who might resist. Piece of cake, right? Yeah, no. The Luddies went ballistic. Faith went absolutely apeshit. Talking heads everywhere expressed skepticism, and about half the governments of the UFS expressed guarded concern. The half, I noted silently, that were on the more authoritarian end of the political spectrum. I wasn't quite sure how Hueys threatened them, but it was obvious they did. Of more immediate concern was the rush of proposed bills, restraining orders, and lawsuit filings intended to delay or block the sale and support of Hueys. Huey LLC, yes, we picked that name, was already the subject of no fewer than 52 restraining orders, 16 class action suits, and 4 threatened government audits. Sighing, I called Hector. Not bothering to sit in front of a screen, I used my internal comms service and generated an avatar for my video image. He came up on a virtual window in my heads-up. I opened the conversation. I suppose you're wondering why I've gathered you here. Hector laughed. Not the least bit. I sent you that report, Howard. Honestly, I expected a little more cursing. You must know what we've been up to. Oh, that was interesting. Hector wasn't acting at all like a CEO who was seeing his company crash and burn. More like someone relishing a fight. Why don't you just update me without making assumptions about what I do or do not know? I said. Quite calmly, I thought. I must have been right because he didn't suddenly look concerned. None of this is unexpected, Howard. We took a page from the Bobs. We've been filing injunctions, counter-injunctions, briefs, getting legal opinions, preparing and pre-filing countersuits, and so on for weeks now. The perpetrators of most of these legal actions will have to spend up to 6 months unraveling all the judicial balls of twine we've been winding before they'll even be able to demand their first meeting with our lawyers. The threatened audits are already 4 layers deep in preemptive lawsuits and show cause orders. Basically, we sowed the entire battlefield with caltrops before we even started. All legal? Nothing illegal. I gave Hector the hairy eyeball. That sounded almost... You've been talking to Will, I exclaimed. If you mean the Bob formerly known as Riker, I plead the fifth. Hector grinned. But yes, he's very cynical about humanity, which is helpful in this kind of fight. In any case, Hector looked down and played with something, and another email popped into my inbox. We have more than 200,000 firm orders with deposits, plus close to 1 million tentative orders queued up already. And every one of those customers could be convinced to join a class action if someone actually managed to delay us. I was impressed. My initial take of Hector as an ass-kisser had wildly missed the mark. This guy was a serious pugilist. I thanked him and hung up. The Hueys were just the tip of the iceberg, of course. Companies that rented Manny's would expand to include generic Hueys in their lineups for people who only occasionally needed one. Companies that stored Manny's for ex-human customers would expand to include Huey storage for still living clients. A new vacation industry would evolve as people realized they could visit other worlds using Hueys instead of spending years in stasis or having to die first. And I owned most of those companies. Well, the Bobiverse did. There were also other, more salacious uses that we really didn't want to advertise to the general public, but it was a dead certainty that a secondary industry would form within a day. 46. Moot time. Bob, July 2344, in Vert. I sent a message to Teresa. Moots in a few mills, see you there? Already arrived, came back immediately. Move your tail. That had become Teresa's favorite expression. For some reason, the Quinlans had never coined the phrase, despite actually having tails. But it had since become from a high-technology vessel of unknown origin, and they found and colonized most of the Pacific Island materials. Light enough for a couple of dragons to carry, Bridget interjected, having followed the conversation. Yep, I think you could get 6 in it at night, carry it in shifts at the end of ropes, and you could probably get across the ocean. Bridget shook her head. It would be risky, and you wouldn't know if there was anything at the end of your trip. Polynesians, I replied. They found and colonized most of the Pacific Islands with nothing but ocean currents and seabirds to guide them. Wait, that doesn't track, Mario said with a frown. You said the canoe is there, on your side. Shouldn't it be on the other continent, Lemuria? Could dragons from the west have come this way? I suggested. No dragons on the west continent, no floaters either, Mario said, shaking his head. It's a completely different ecosystem, also much less tectonically active. I think it's an older, thicker plate. He paused. We actually did some light mining there since there was no intelligent life to deal with. Huh. I looked at Bridget and she shrugged. Okay, that's something for further investigation. But nevertheless, they have a boat made from a high-technology vessel of unknown origin, and they put it literally on a pedestal. It's significant, and we have to figure out why. I paused. And what about the piece of wreckage? That is not human or Bob-made, Mario replied. It's definitely part of a Scud assembly. You can't mistake the design, but it's way more advanced than our stuff. But you can recognize the device's purpose? Bridget asked. The advances are evolutionary, not revolutionary, Mario replied. But definitely decades ahead of us, at minimum. And yes, physics dictates what a Scud assembly is going to look like. So, where are the builders? Good question, Howard. Good question. We were back in our apartment, and Bridget had been hammering away at her canvas for hours. Finally, she reclined in her chair, put her hand over her eyes, and moaned. All theater, of course, for a computer running an android body. Still, I could sympathize. She'd been poring over every video recording that showed some of the dragon scrolls. Not going well? I said.
I've got spy drones watching over the shoulders of the other librarians to pick up as much as possible. It'd be great if I could just ask my subject to hold up the scroll so I could see it. But now I have to depend on whatever they're doing, and keep the drone out of sight. The little drones are just camouflaged, not invisible. I can't risk moving them too much.
Yeah, I get it. So how's progress?
Not great. Gandalf and company only gave me the basic written vocabulary that you'd find out in public and maybe in people's homes. These scrolls contain about 80% of the dragon language that I don't have documentation for. And no pictures, and no one reads out loud, so I'm having trouble establishing enough context to identify words.
She paused.
The scrolls I'm personally able to look at are mostly tables of numbers. Numbers are a lot easier. Well, a little easier. They don't use a numeric system like we do. It's more like the love child of Roman numerals and cuneiform, but it is numbers.
And they are counting
fish.
She nodded.
As we expected. And yes, the numbers are going down. And have been for a while.
Down? As in?
There are fewer fish every year. Significantly so.